I think we're kind of going through kind of a critical transition in terms of what kinds of um, questions we need to be asking about institutional design in the 21st century. It's clear that, a lot of the old sorts of questions that we were asking ourselves maybe are going to be um, less applicable to the sort of questions that we need to address in the future. One thing I think about a lot in particular is kind of just the dominant role that identity has played specifically in the 20th century and in maybe this kind of last gasp of the 21st century, in structuring all of our political systems, right? It really feels like the last century started with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and everything kind of went to crap after that. And, just thinking about the development of that empire and how everything was so identity laden and nationalistic at the time, um, I wonder to what extent identity issues are eventually going to disappear, and we're going to be asking more questions about what is the role of humanity in sort of the future systems that we're developing. Are we going to really need humans as primary agents in many things? And it's kind of a scary thing to think about,
Well,
but
identity is a weird concept because we tend to think of it as like this very subjective thing, but it's actually almost entirely socially defined.
yeah.
And so, I mean, I don't know exactly what you mean by like the identity laden development of like nationalism to me is almost antithetical to, or I guess it is a kind of social identity.
Hmm.
Um, but it's antithetical to like the more subjective identity that we think of. And I guess that is the linguistic trick that was pulled in the late 20th century, was changing identity from this thing where it's defined by people outside of you, by your peer group and your family and the broader culture that you're part of, to being something that you just individually decide based on your own whims,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, we started chunking ourselves into certain groups rather than into our individual units in that way. Um, yeah, I agree. But that seemed to govern that chunking seemed to govern, almost all of politics in the 20th century, and similarly all of our social issues today are seemingly that, right?
Yeah, and like I mean I yeah, there's a lot to talk about already, but first off, before we get I guess any deeper into this line of thought, I want to just, for those of you who aren't familiar, Cody Moser is a PhD candidate at University of California, Merced's Department of Cognitive and Information Sciences. Um, and he's got a quite varied background. Previously, he was involved in evolutionary anthropology, but he's been sort of studying culture and adaptive systems and innovation and networks for a long time. Longtime listeners of the show will remember that previously Cody and I talked about um, did a whole interview on his research in network science and sort of core periphery networks and the relationship of network topology to innovation and the speed of innovation and the quality of innovation. Um, and so I just find Cody to be, and Cody also was someone that was a semi-regular guest on my old show. And so I found Cody to be just a really insightful and interesting person who seems to just be interested in these fundamental problems of like society, evolution, networks, innovation, how social coordination happens, intelligence. And I think that, I don't know where he views his research going in the long term. I would actually love to ask you that, and maybe we'll get to that today. Um, but I feel like the things that you're focused on are moving in the direction of something fundamental to discoveries about how we organize society and optimize that for advancement. So um, anyway, this is my long-winded introduction of Cody Moser, and so I'm just happy to have you back on the show and giving everybody sort of an update about who you are and why we'd like to talk.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. And it's pretty funny. I was thinking about, what all have I kind of accomplished in terms of my thinking over the course of this PhD. And since I switched from anthropology to this more, computational social science kind of thing. And what kind of questions have I really settled on? And um, in one of the interviews on your previous show, you and I spoke quite a bit about the scientist Rupert Sheldrake and the role of these kinds of, outliers in pushing scientific innovation and things like that. And of course, that turned into a project I did um, with my co-author Jesse Miltzman on these core periphery networks and how those facilitate innovation and things. And I think those kinds of topics have kind of now turned into, I think, a reframing of a lot of the issues that I've been thinking about in terms of my own research, but also in terms of what I think is important for social systems. And so, you and I were speaking about identity a moment ago and this kind of chunking of the individual up into their groups. Something I've been thinking about a lot more lately and what the purpose of all this kind of networks-based research and asking about social institutions is. And I wonder at times now if our framing about a lot of these questions have been, I don't know, on the wrong level, right?
Mm,
So, in a lot of these projects, the kinds of things that you do is you ask, oh, what's the right institutional arrangement to solve a problem that looks like this, right? And you
mm,
design a model and you create all the agents and they go off and they do their thing. And then you say that climate change is solved, and then you get a grant trying to solve more theoretical climate change and so on and so forth. And I mean, all of that is great, right? If we are just simply thinking about institutions and collectives. If I'm simply just saying, what's the right collective? What's the right Borg space for solving these sorts of things? Um, those are genuine questions to ask. But when you kind of go back a little bit and you ask, okay, well, how do you actually manifest this in the real world? How do you get people to do this? You start hitting questions about, well, how do I get people to make the right decisions? Or how is it that I place people in the right positions such that they can enact social change or, exhibit something like social agency? And
mm,
so, kind of the questions that I'm moving into lately are those sorts of questions, or questions of um, how do people enact their own agency in the world to make these kinds of radical changes, and what kinds of institutions can we have such that people end up being able to make those choices that they have, rather than presupposing as the designer from the outside that this is something that groups just need to do.
mm. And so what is the telos of your research?
Hmm.
Why are you doing this?
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, so a while back, I did a translation of an interview between Friedrich Hayek and, at the time, I think he was just a priest, Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI.
Mm,
And in this interview, Hayek and the others, they're asked the question, like, what's the role of the intellectual in society? And Hayek very famously, kind of anti-intellectual guy says, well, in the House of the Hanged Man, you shouldn't talk about ropes. We're in a radio station. Let's not talk about intellectualism. You've killed intellectualism, and the intellectuals have killed intellectualism, and people should stop proffering opinions and things like that. And Hayek just gets totally reamed by all the other people on this panel. They're like, that guy's silly. Like, obviously, we're doing all this stuff for a reason. But eventually it gets to Ratzinger, and Ratzinger's whole view is, I think that Hayek guy, as weird he is, is probably right. But really, what needs to happen is we need kind of a restructuring of the sort of questions that are asked in science, because as of now, we've left up we've left the questions of, meaning and humanity's place in larger things up to the theologians, and we
Mhm.
haven't been very good with this. We ourselves are really bad stewards of these sorts of questions, and the real challenge for science in terms of becoming a new thing going forward is actually bringing humans back into it. And so I'd like at some point, to move forward using the kinds of tools that I've developed over the last few years of, computational modeling and understanding um, societies as these kinds of complex systems, to understand more about the role of causality in these sorts of systems, as a way of identifying, how is it that we can empower people. So there's my current research is kind of taking the direction of trying to understand causality in complex systems, but specifically in light of trying to understand, um, what is the role of the human in the kind of societal cage that they're living in.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. And
Right.
oh no, go ahead.
Well, I mean, yeah, and it's going to be a more serious question moving forward. We're at a point where, I think the big question, maybe in this century and certainly in the ones afterwards, is just going to be like, what does it mean to even be human and have this kind of illusion of free will and choice? Right now, we have, automation is taking away our jobs, even outside the prospect of AI.
Mhm.
AI is taking away the interesting things from us, right? It's coming for art and writing before it's coming for, working at McDonald's, which, I don't think anyone really wants to do. Um, and so we have to think more seriously about how is it that we're going to be able to facilitate people's ability to enact change. And it's not just a like full-blown automation issue. It's the fact that our world is increasingly getting smaller and smaller. The kinds of things that are happening 6 degrees from me right now in terms of my social spheres are really happening even closer, given that my social spheres are shrinking in online spaces. Um, I was recently thinking about, I've seen the disappearance of local economies in all kinds of different places. Back in my hometown in Florida, in the town I'm in UC Merced, finishing my PhD, and where I am now, I'm at UCLA, and just seeing in Los Angeles, these kinds of local economies are disappearing. They've all been kind of shifted into online spaces rather than being, places that we actually walk around with and interact with in the real world.
Yeah.
Um,
So you have this dematerialization
yeah,
going on an economic scale, and that has profound effects on just our day-to-day lives, what our cities look like, what our social lives look like,
yeah,
how we like the opportunities to interact with each other, even in a serendipitous way, are just disappearing.
yeah, yeah, disappearing and you get online and you can make your voice heard and try to switch to these online spaces, but there's massive compression happening there. Everything's so fast. There's really, very few people are adapted for that kind of space, to really get their voice heard. And so it doesn't strike me as surprising that people would, rather sit at home and scroll through TikTok than actually actively go out and try to do something, because, our space of affordances are massively shrinking right now. What any individual person can do, it just seems, is this kind of diminishing horizon for humans, at least in the West, right?
Yeah, it's very funny to me because when I think back to when I first started making content online, I was stuck in a sort of small town in Michigan. And the reason I started making content online was because I didn't find the kind of conversations that I wanted to have happen in my local community. I was
Hmm.
using the online as an outlet to uh, live, I guess, the kind of social and intellectual life that I couldn't find locally. Um, and I've been fortunate enough in that over time, due to sort of the progression of my career and also the intensification of my online activities, that my digital life and my real life have more or less converged, where I spend more time with the same kind of people that I would be talking to online anyway, and vice versa. But obviously that avenue is not open to everyone, and also it shouldn't be an obligation for everyone to go do that. Like,
Yeah.
a world where everyone has to have like a following or an online presence of some kind in order to feel connected, feel relevant, is a horrible world, but also totally untenable. Um, so I definitely I definitely see that happening and feel that very closely. Um, what I'm wondering about though is if maybe that's only the part of things that is visible to us,
Hmm.
because I would venture to guess that there is a large chunk of humanity, and I don't just mean like Luddites, uh, just a large chunk of people who actually aren't that online
Hmm.
and who still primarily spend most of their day in sort of non-online activities. And I would wonder if there's just a fundamental disconnect between almost two types of human that are diverging, the
Hmm.
the tribes that sort of live online and the tribes that don't.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. One thing I would ask though is to what extent is that real world, I don't even want to use that term, non-online tribe, um, something that's getting phased out. I mean, is it the case that the Zoomers in Alpha are, going to, I don't know, figure a way out of this kind of sphere, these kinds of problems? I honestly, I haven't looked at the data. I'm not really sure.
Well, 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 I would say like, so first of all, obviously there's a lot of external pressure to participate in these systems. You're
Yeah.
incentivized financially, socially. Uh, there are a lot of ways, even just using basic services and getting goods. Most of that for a lot of people is online now. Um, However, I would say like sort of the first step in maybe being a conscientious objector to this is just deciding to live your life with more intentionality, right? Just
Hmm.
thinking about the choices that you're making in terms of the systems that you're interacting with and how that entrenches your habits of behavior, right? And then reverse engineering from the kind of life that you want to be living, the requisite steps, you know, that would make that happen. Now, I think that's something that someone who's conscientious and aware and intelligent is capable of doing. But I guess the tragedy or the sad thing is that um, uh, it's no longer the default, right? The
Yeah.
default is not going to be in-person communities that are deeply connected, that feel rooted together, that have genuine experiences. That's going to be something that only a select few, for whatever, cognitive or dispositional reasons, are going to choose.
Yeah. Yeah, this whole conversation, I've just been thinking about Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart,
Yeah. Or
you
bowling
know,
alone.
or Bowling Alone, right? Yeah, 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 exactly. This view that there's this kind of, well, starting in the 1960s, bifurcation culturally in American society between these elites who are no longer intermingling with the, hoi polloi in their Des Moines, Iowa neighborhoods. We're now aggregating into these super zip codes with their own totally different cultural systems, despite also being Americans from the people next to them. I find this point about intentionality interesting because it's so hard. It's like, uh, the system at this point is no longer opt in. It feels like everything's totally opt out.
Mhm.
And we're kind of helpless to really change the tides of how that's going. I hate when I'm trying to find a place to park and I have to download some stupid new app. At this point, I'm opting into even smaller and smaller systems that I want no part of. Yeah, um, it's it's a hard problem. Um, trying to identify ways to, you know, ways to get people to try and enact that kind of intentionality. It's what's really hard is giving people the kinds of social role models that make it seem like these kinds of strategies are actually tenable or useful. Our
Yeah.
current education system is, I mean, it's almost as if you were teaching students at the advent of computers without teaching them about computers, right? You might be putting them back 5 to 10 years. If in 2012 your high school did not have programming courses, you were putting your students back a few years. It feels like now the sets of problems that people are going to have to face, just even as people, are so different from the sorts of things that education in general were designed to deal with, uh, that now the difference between what education sets you up for and the kinds of things you have to do in the real world is like being taught something from the dark ages. It feels we're at a total loss for preparing people for this, strange new world that we've kind of jumped into.
Well, maybe one of those solutions, I talked about intentionality before, is
Hmm.
sort of return to sort of more, for lack of a better term, Lindy,
Hmm.
um, you know, pedagogies in terms of organized religion,
Hmm.
philosophy, the sort of humanistic disciplines that encourage you to just sort of be reflective and um, connected. It seems like, if I may, you could posit that these systems are organically evolved, like social systems that for dealing precisely with this problem. Now, people can say like, oh, it's obvious that, organized religion is also insufficient for this new environment. But it seems like that would be like a good place to start, at least,
Mm.
if you want to pick up some of the pieces of what a social system that might allow people to cope with this more readily would look like.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, totally. Something I've been really interested in this kind of calling light to like organized religion is this whole process of almost like cultural catastrophic interference that we've gone through recently. So for people who don't know too much about machine learning, catastrophic interference is when you have, say, like a neural network and you train it on some problem A, right? And it, becomes optimized for problem A and it can solve it and deal with it. You now introduce it to problem B and it comes optimized for problem B. It can solve that. You bring it back to A, and it has no idea what it's looking at again. It's not able to deal with some of those things. And I look at different online communities like Teapot, this part of Twitter and other places. This just seems to be rapidly proliferating in the Bay Area. That people are like, what if we all just kind of got together weekly with our kids and talked about the kind of moral and ethical problems?
Yeah, right. Talked about our lives and what's
Yeah,
going on
yeah.
with us.
And it's like, oh, yeah, there seems to be this like attractor space in the human mind that, for whatever reason, we forgot that we needed some of that old software for a while, and now it's cropping up as it's been elicited, and for some reason that um, I can't really I have no ways of identifying, but
Well, this has always been my critique of the rationalists, and I guess most of them would be sort of post-rat now, but
mhm.
was that they just spend so much time reinventing the wheel,
Yeah,
like rediscovering things that because they were too hasty to throw everything else away, basically.
yeah.
Um, but enough about critiquing them. I wanted to bring up a slide real quick from one of your papers that you,
Hmm.
not papers, I guess, talks that you shared with me, which has to do with sort of the relationship um, of innovation to the size and shape of networks.
Hmm.
And sort of there's two tensions or characteristics uh, that I want to just ask you about, which is one is that it seems to be that larger populations innovate faster, right? So if you
Yeah,
have a given network and the population is larger, the innovation happens faster. This has sort of always been the idea with like network effects in large cities,
yeah,
why big cities are sort of the epicenters of innovation. And then also there's this seeming tension with network connectivity, where more, at least according to this slide you shared, where more sparsely connected networks also have uh, improved speed of innovation.
yeah,
And so, first off, I guess I have two questions on this. One is I want to talk about that tension between network size and network connectivity,
yeah.
because you would assume that as the network grows in size, it becomes more connected. And then, secondly, I want to ask you a little bit about the context of that in terms of this general social reconfiguration we've been talking about of online life, online communities, network tribes, whatever people want to call them. So
Hmm.
let's start with the first one and then we can move on to the second.
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is this finding that uh, in most cultural systems, larger populations, or at least this is true for the modeling literature, and it seems like for a lot of the empirical stuff anthropologically, is that larger populations tend to innovate more and faster than smaller ones.
Mhm.
But at the same time, if you look at population connectivity, so whether or not even in these large populations, people are more connected or less connected. Um, if you look at that effect, what you find is that the less connected populations are innovating more, more than the more connected ones. So you could imagine this like if you had a giant conference space and you had 100 people in the room and you said, all right, I need you all to deliberate on some problem I've given you. Figure out this for the next term or something. If you just have 100 people in the same room and they're all saying the same things, right? What's going to happen there is you're going to amplify noise, including bad noise. Kind of the loudest person is going to end up taking over a lot more. Think about this a lot with you see a lot of bad opinions on TikTok and like, and they tend to come from attractive people. Uh, but if you end up taking, those 100 people and you put them into 10 smaller rooms and you have them sub-deliberate, and then they come out and have an opinion and then bring those opinions together, you'll tend to get better solutions. Um, and so the tension there is that, yeah, we certainly seems like want more people so that we have more opportunities for um, having those dice rolls of innovation or thinking about things. But at the same time, you don't want everyone talking to each other. You actually want to limit that as much as possible on the system level, um, which is kind of a problem, I think, for this modeling literature, aka all the research I've ever done, which is that on some level it says, the population is going to end up coming with the right solution if you subdivide it into these spaces. But one thing is that that right solution doesn't necessarily percolate to everyone. It's not the case that that right solution then becomes fixated. You have to be able to, from the outside of the system, identify where exactly that solution originated, or if it did. Um, from a God's eye view, you have to know that. And so I think there are a lot of open questions in terms of not only what kinds of structures should we be looking at to permit innovation from arising, but should we maybe be looking for ones which allow for example, things like we call Merton multiples. So the Merton multiples are these effects from the sociology of science, where it seems like sometimes in spaces of innovation, things get rediscovered more than once independently by different people. Is there system design which facilitates that, this kind of spontaneity of the same things in different places? And is that perhaps a way of churning out other things?
Mm.
The other thing is that this effect of large population sizes is a little bit mysterious in some way. So something that you can look at is you can take networks that have the same connectivity. So we'll just use connectivity for some general level of who's connected to who.
Mm.
And so if you have what you call a random network with a connectivity level of 0.5, so that means that you're connected with a probability of half to everyone in the network. In
Mm.
a network of 100 individuals, that means that you're connected to like 50 people on average.
Right.
In a network of 10 individuals, you're connected to five. When you break down the amount of work it takes in both of those groups to basically come up with the same quality solutions, it's the same amount of work per capita. This is despite the fact that locally these are very different networks for the agents that they're in. Me talking as an individual to 50 different people is way different from me talking to five.
Mm.
But for some reason, it's almost as if talking to five people 10 times gets you the same amount of work that talking to 50 people once does. Um,
That's weird.
yeah, it's something that I've been trying to work out a lot more recently. Is it the case that the noise that an individual receives in these kinds of contexts is equivalent to the amount of input? Does it scale similarly between these smaller systems and these larger systems?
Mm.
I don't know. Um, and so that's something that's really weird to determine, are these kinds of per capita effects when you actually end up removing scale or you control for size in certain ways. A lot of the same properties exist despite these networks being very different in everything that isn't related to scale.
Mm. The classic example of like a network that produced a tremendous amount of of innovation that people give is Bell Labs, right?
Yeah.
And I recently reread Cal Newport's like Deep Work because I like to go back to it when I feel like I'm not focusing enough.
Hmm.
And he brings up Bell Labs also as well, but the way that he thinks about it is that they had this literally like the office structure of the building was set up so that there was a mixture of both like solitary spaces where people could do their work
Yeah.
quietly, but then also these long hallways where scientists across different disciplines would encounter one
Mm.
another and be able to have side conversations about what they were working on. And this sort of duality of like long periods in isolation with brief periods of serendipitous connection,
Yeah.
but was responsible for the large amount of innovation. Um, And I've heard similar arguments like this before. And I guess the question I was getting to is sort of the second question related to this point that I brought up about the relationship of network size and connectivity,
Hmm.
is that when you think about the sort of siloing of internet culture, about how sort of we're each developing our own kind of bespoke uh, set of network connections and little mini universes on the internet. And we
Hmm.
think that like we're super connected because, I'm, you know, 1 to 2 degrees of separation away from Elon Musk, even though I've never met the guy and probably won't soon. Um, Yet sometimes I'm reminded that I'll find a Twitter account that's got like uh, you know, 600,000 followers
Mm.
with no mutual connections, right? And then I'm like, oh, I'm reminded that there's this whole universe that I'm just like completely effectively walled off from,
Yeah.
right? And so I guess what I'm getting at is like you can almost think of some of these certain online platforms as an instantiation of those two principles, where you
Yeah.
have massive networks that are actually like relatively disconnected.
Yeah.
And I guess the struggle for me as someone who is trying to make content online and come up with new ideas, and uh, I'm also an engineer, so I'm building stuff and I'm building products and I'm trying to come up with ideas for those. Um, is like I never know if my networks are getting too incestuous, like if I'm getting
Yeah.
too much of the same signals. And it's actually quite difficult. It's actually quite hard to not let your network become convergent over time around the same kinds of people and ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Maybe you need to like go on a cruise ship and like listen to like Hawk Tuah podcast or something, and maybe that'll be like a good
Oh boy. Oh boy.
uh,
Yeah.
a true
Is there
anthropological
a
view of the
scaling law
other.
there where it's like for every 5 Haktua listens, I get one, I don't know, what's a good show in my sphere? I actually don't listen to a lot of other people's podcasts. It's sort of my conceit uh as an interviewer. But anyway, so I think I'm just sort of rambling at this point, but giving you hopefully a lot to chew on with regard to that. I wonder, I guess, whether the speed of innovation is actually good for human beings.
Yeah.
Because it seems like the systems that we're setting up are actually accelerating the pace of innovation. You've got like the effective accelerationists, the EAC people. And uh I've mentioned this a few times. I'm not making a hobby horse out of it, but I do think it's worth mentioning. The EAC people are fundamentally anti-human. Like
Yeah,
they actually
exactly.
don't care about the future of human beings or their subjective well-being at all. They are sort of a cult around machine intelligence, and they view that, bringing about a higher intelligence than us is like the prime imperative. And anyway, all of this is saying that it may be that the conditions that optimize innovation actually make human life miserable.
I totally agree. And
And so that's a trade-off we have to make. Like if we want more innovation, there might be a lot of suffering.
precisely. I mean, we also have to
The
ask like,
innovation maximizer.
yeah, maximize or we have to ask ourselves like what is the optimizing function on the things that we're innovating, right? My big concern is that we're already living in the post-human society. In some way we are like already basically LLMs in the sense that we kind of ignore this space and the people around us. We go first for, what's kind of in the digital already. We're already halfway there. Like, I suspect that if we ask people, would you like to be, hooked up to this thing and you actually won't have to leave your house and you can explore everything on the digital space. Um, a non-scary amount of people with a certain framing would realize we're basically doing that already.
Yeah.
Um, and so, I mentioned earlier already a couple people. Pope Benedict XVI. It's funny, I'm not Catholic, but just like in the last couple of years, I've found myself like profoundly influenced by these different Catholic thinkers. And a couple of them I found really important are Michael Polanyi and Ivan Illich. And so basically, one of the things that Ivan talks about in his book, Tools for Conviviality, is that the and he's a difficult thinker to place. I think at the time his book was too far ahead for what it was doing. People were still trying to frame this as some kind of, oh, is he actually Marxist? Is he actually capitalist? Really, what he was just pure humanist. He's like, the thing is that our production systems are really isolating us from each other, and the kinds of tools that we're developing are not the things that grant people the ability to sit down and think more about the kinds of problems in their life, but kind of gloss over them or find new outlets. And so he said basically what we need to be doing as we're innovating or coming up with technologies is finding this space where we're facilitating better human interactions, or at least better recognition of ourselves. We're not isolating ourselves from ourselves using the new tools that we're building. And I mean that's already in a way, yeah. I mean, I think that's pretty much more or less kind of what you're getting at is trying to bring the human back into our systems of innovation. Because we can keep this thing going. If I get taken out tomorrow, like that CEO or whatever in New York the other day, I think yesterday, if I just get taken out tomorrow, someone's going to definitely take my place in producing the types of papers that I'm producing. In a way, there's this kind of superstructure that's already forming that's in a way demanding human agents to take its place inside and do the rest of the work in the system.
Hmm.
Um,
Do you think that
James,
it's making us more fungible?
oh, I think 100%. And
Hmm.
it's not that we're simply more fungible on a systems level. We're more fungible to each other. I think in many ways we're more fungible to ourselves. I hear so many people all the time talking about, human life, it really has no value. And if you look at the
Really?
current,
Who's saying that?
I mean, people in AI space that I work with all the time, and
Oh.
but if you just think about the kinds of intellectual tools and production systems that we've granted people, we've had nothing but conceptual assaults against free will and human agency, and nothing but more ways of pulling people out of the system or making them more replaceable. People are going to naturally come to these absolutely nihilistic conclusions. But, if we're looking at how the production system is centered and our kind of powerlessness to really change where they are, um, my advisor and I have a paper that we're working on what we call these information architectures, as people are kind of more placed in these giant architectures. They find themselves less likely to be able to change them, despite them exhibiting this kind of top-down massive influence on them.
Hmm.
Um, and so something that I think people can do is to maybe pivot, like you were saying, very intentionally on ways to feed back into that system new tools for allowing people to find that kind of self-actualization. It's that let me join up with this Leviathan that's eating us alive, if only to carve out a space for myself and others in it.
Yeah, I definitely feel that anxiety about becoming more fungible.
Hmm.
And also like the weird uh desire to resist viewing others as fungible as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um and how that kind of like warps our social space. And I guess just going back to this concept of like human suffering and its relationship to innovation and acceleration and the kind of system that we're building and that we're all kind of part of, and that most of humanity has to participate in one way or the other.
Hmm.
Um, you know, there was a lot of slaves that died building the pyramids,
Yeah.
right? And so, and we have these great monuments, but the question is like, are we just building a monument to human misery or not?
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe we have a choice to not do that. Is I
Yeah.
guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. 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 Um,
And also, are the systems we're even building that beautiful? Like I can, like there's a part of me that's sort of sympathetic to the you know, brutal aesthetic revolution where, all human suffering is uh, like human suffering can be justified for great art or for great works of achievement. And
mm,
I think that everyone who's working very tirelessly, someone like Elon Musk understands that quite well.
mhm.
He's willing to subject himself to all kinds of suffering in order to sort of towards some set of ideals about moving humanity forward. Um, and so I'm sympathetic to some amount of justification. But if the system is really just serving like itself as its own ends, and there's not any payout for humanity at the end of it,
Yeah.
then it does seem like we're just sort of participating in this like mass masochistic exercise of subjecting ourselves to more and more suffering uh, towards nothing, towards something that isn't even beautiful, that we wouldn't even regard as worthy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm just getting too pessimistic here, but
I was thinking about this the other day with Facebook, right?
yeah, Facebook is a good example.
Yeah, half the time
I'm
when
sorry, Mark. Like,
yeah, I mean, things could be better, right?
yeah.
When you get on Facebook right now, usually like one of the first things I see is like some like AI generated veteran with like no
Oh,
leg, and
you have
it
more
says
slop.
like, yeah, it's like I got no likes, and it's like clearly this like someone prompted some diffusion model to spit out a gazillion of these things,
Yeah.
then scheduled them to just be printed. And then when you
And
click though,
the system is set up to reward this person for this
exactly,
activity. Even if they
exactly.
don't want to, even if they know that it's wrong or think it's stupid, they're like, well, I just am purely self-interested in in utilizing this system that has this incentive structure
Yeah,
that just is like almost infinitely wasteful, but also like pointless. I don't know. It's just as someone who
well,
like I work in AI now, and um there's always this temptation of like, oh, I could just like go create an account that just like produces slop and I could make like 10,000 a month from it. But like
yeah.
it's so messed up. But obviously like we haven't figured out a way to to stem these messed up incentive structures.
Well, what's really been kind of a critical reframing to me is that I see the AI slop, and I see then you click on the comments, also AI.
Mm.
And what I think is, I'm like, oh, this
Yeah,
is
and then
so
you're like,
messed
are there
up.
any real humans here?
Yeah, are there any humans in this loop? And but what I think about is I'm like, oh man, this is so messed up. Like it should be human generated garbage and then
Yeah,
human
right, right.
generated garbage comments underneath it. And I'm like, were we really any better or any different? Uh,
Well. So one of the hopeful things, as someone who's like building in the AI space, I'm not
yeah.
building like consumer products at the moment, but a lot of people are, and a lot of people are also doing things like automated sales, automated marketing, and one like bright side of this is that, you said earlier that AI is automating a lot of the interesting stuff, and that is
Yeah.
true, but it's also automating a lot of the drudgery.
Hmm.
Like an AI agent that makes you know, 1,000 robocalls a day and closes sales deals based on those robocalls. Yeah, it's a little dystopian to think that like when your phone is ringing, you're just talking to an AI and it's trying to sell you on some garbage. But at the same time, it has to at least be a little bit better than like phenomenologically than a human having to make 1,000 calls a day and try
Yeah,
to sell
yeah,
you some garbage.
yeah. I mean, my thought there though is that, if you reframe, yeah, about, the human selling the garbage or the human posting the slop, as you called it, um, is like maybe that just tells us that those systems were anti-human to begin with. Did I
Yeah.
really care about, what this person was doing so I've been trying to get better about like saying, oh man, AI is taking away all my shit, all the bad things um and thinking more like maybe that just shouldn't be part of the system to begin with. And so I don't know, think about like from a Heideggerian perspective, right, of technology as a revealing. Maybe this is one of those such revealings in this case is now we're seeing the things we didn't like about society, and in some ways, maybe by taking the human out of it, it becomes that much clearer that it's not something we wanted.
And also
Um,
the things we didn't like about ourselves.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
for example, like as a podcast host, it will probably be true in the near future, and and by that I mean like within a couple of years,
Hmm.
that there's going to be some AI podcast host who actually is talking probably to not even real guests, but maybe real guests, but definitely to other AIs, and that show will actually like be entertaining enough or
Mm,
informative enough to like have a real audience. Like
yeah.
that's 100% coming. And then the question becomes like, why am I doing this? Like, why am I talking to you? Why am I spending my time going and curating the show and getting these interviews and talking to people uh, when maybe an AI is doing it instead, and also maybe they're even doing it better. Like,
Hmm.
it could very well be that there's an AI podcast that's like tremendously successful and generates lots of money for its creators. Um, and the answer to that question would have to be like, you're doing this because this activity is in itself worth doing inherently, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then that becomes the only things that humans are left to do. I mean, other than like generally we have to create some value to survive and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
And that's, I mean, we don't need to get into like the whole like AI eliminating all jobs situation. I don't I don't have good intuitions about where that's going. But what I will say is, I think that it points to, again, a kind of reflection on like, would you be doing this for its own sake, or are you just
Yeah,
doing this for some other weird incentive structure
yeah,
that's
yeah,
around
yeah,
you? You
yeah,
know,
yeah. I think I agree with that. It's like I was have you taken Waymo?
no, I've never taken it, but I see them driving around.
Yeah, that's been having me think about a lot of things. Waymo, just as a driver on the road, it's a great neighbor because once you understand how one Waymo drives, you understand how all the Waymos around you drive.
Hmm.
So overall, they're good for the road in that manner. And one of the big issues is we're saying, oh, it's taking away, jobs from Uber and Lyft drivers. And it's like, are those really jobs that like people
Want to be
want?
doing?
Yeah, yeah. Which is like to say, yeah, like we're saying, like people do need jobs, right? Um,
Well, I don't know.
maybe, yeah, maybe UBI will pan out.
I have mixed feelings about it. I don't know about UBI. I also don't know that. Uh, I guess in my world, and maybe it's because I'm sort of already sort of in this cybernetic loop a little more than most people. Um, a lot of the jobs that are going to be in the future are going to be just AI augmented, you
Okay,
know,
yeah.
because most of the AI systems that we have, there needs to be a human in the loop somewhere. And what's really happening is that the segments of the loop where a human needs to be are just getting more sparse.
Hmm.
right? And so maybe you have a big loop and then a human at the end, or you have a big loop with like a human here and a human here. Whereas before there would have been a human at this step and this step and this step and this step. And all of the automation stuff that we're doing, whether it's supply chain or manufacturing or code or whatever else, is just we're just decreasing the frequency of human interactions with these systems.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then
Yeah.
hopefully that creates enough value that most people can have some kind of position in that.
Hmm.
If you think it's positive sum, of course.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
But
Yeah.
there's, yeah, anyway, it's just, it's tricky because like any other technological innovation, like, you know, the popularization of the automobile, did put a lot of horse drivers out of business,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, but there was some value to the idea that at least we had the mental, right? We had the creative that we could kind of latch on to. Um, I do get, I mean, this is probably just an ego thing, but like, when I'm programming and I'm stuck on a problem and I realize I gotta like launch Chatty, um, a little piece of me dies inside each time that I wasn't able to rough it through that problem and do it myself. Because I know I would have gotten there, right? Um, but I do it for the sake of convenience to save time. Um,
So, uh, where do you see, this research going? Collective
mhm.
intelligence, networks, efficiency. I mean, what's really at the end of this for you? Is it an academic job? Are you going to go into industry? Do you want to uh, sort of develop your own framework and do consulting on that? Like, I'm just interested in like what,
Mhm.
and maybe this is an unfair question because you're still in the middle of it, but
Oh, it's a good question, and I can tell you a little bit about where I think can think tell you where I think things might go theoretically, and I can tell you at least where I'm going. So for terms of understanding collective intelligence and the like, a lot of our models are this discipline is supposedly very recent. Um, this is a new thing for the 2000s, but really a lot of our models are all the same model. Um, if you go back, you know, about 120 years, you'll end up in terms of important work that was being done on collectives, at the work of Ludwig Boltzmann and many others who were developing kind of the new science of statistical mechanics and
mhm.
thermodynamics. It turns out that all of this work had massive influence on, many other places. So, for example, the development of Austrian economics and marginal utility theorem by Karl Menger in the 19th century had a lot to do with him seeing what Boltzmann had done for physics and saying, I want this for social science.
Mm.
Um, and then, of course, Hayek came out of that strain, and many others who were thinking about complex systems and sociality. R.A. Fisher thought that what he was doing with Fisher's fundamental theorem, um, which states that natural selection or the strength of selection is equal to the variance, which my advisor and I showed for collective systems in a paper last year, um, thought that what he was doing with that law was effectively coming up with a law of thermodynamics equivalent for biological species. Currently, we know that there are formal equivalences between thermodynamics and Bayesian inference,
Mhm.
between thermodynamics and population genetics. A lot of ongoing work, really cool, cutting edge stuff, looking at how Bayesian inference and replicator dynamics, population genetics are also effectively formally the same. And this keeps going. The Nobel Prize in physics given to Hopfield was statistical mechanics result that currently what's used a lot for understanding collective intelligence is the lens-easing model, which Hopfield was basing all of his work off of. Um, and so currently we're stuck, rather, we're not stuck, but we're hyper inspired by these computational approaches that came out of statistical physics and this understanding um, of how collective systems work from the viewpoint of what happened in Austria during that time.
Mhm.
And kind of the question that you can end up with there is that if all of our computational systems are based off of these things where you have collectives that then um, go from this kind of dissipative state to equilibrium. If that is some kind of a unifying principle behind computation, if it is the case that all computational systems have something to do with this, what we would call free energy reduction. And so
Mhm.
this is a lot of the work of Carl Friston and his idea of the free energy principle is based off of this. I'm not saying he's right or that he's even wrong, but it is clear why someone was eventually going to come up with that theory because that's where all of our tools are sitting.
Mhm.
But there are some alternatives. Like it doesn't seem that this is how living systems compute. We tend to have to compute in far from equilibrium states.
Mhm.
You and I are not only, um, these kinds of systems that tend towards equilibrium, but we're ones that, by spending energy, we tend to keep ourselves outside of equilibrium states. So the kind of person who is really important for developing this line of thinking was Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize in physics in the late 20th century. And his view of these dissipative systems was that living systems are computing in a totally different way than the way that we can think about um, most other things doing. And so his theory of dissipative systems um, might actually be another way of thinking about computational frameworks going forward in the future, thinking about not only collective systems, but maybe more general systems of intelligence might be able to draw something from these non-equilibrium frameworks. And so I've been
What do you
thinking,
mean
yeah,
by living systems maintain in equilibrium?
yeah, so we're constantly spending our energy to acquire more. Um, it doesn't seem the case that we fall into these regularized regimes, right? Um, a good example is that if you look at, say, the development of a human being from a sperm and an egg, right? You get
Mhm.
that combination of the gametes. In any simple case, you should expect things to stop right there, or there should just be this cell dividing process, maybe. But instead, what you get is this continuous growth from, what is effectively a single-celled oocyte into, the thing that is talking to you right now on a computer today.
Mhm.
This is not something that could have been predicted from the outset. It's clear that what living systems are doing is they are negotiating new ways of living, new forms of growth specifically, thinking about not only is it the case that I'm not going to reduce myself, but I am going to become larger. I'm going to figure out new ways of spending the energy around me in more
Mhm.
efficient manners to go and capture more and more. So a lot of the work that was done on this was done in the early 20th century. by the I think he was a physicist, but Lotka. Lotka was famous for these Lotka-Volterra models of um, examining how, for example, hares and foxes would kind of um, evolve in their population structures over time with each other. And his view was that um, the evolution of living systems is more or less defined by the amount of energy they're able to capture.
Mhm.
Um, and not only that is it the case that living systems are simply capturing energy, they're finding better and better ways of spending it and finding new niches to jump into. Um, as far as I can tell, that kind of framework, well, it was very much developed in kind of a dynamical systems language. It was never really turned computational. You don't see that very often. I think maybe reservoir computing is one place where you see, for example, on-the-fly learning and the ability to kind of just pick up new tasks with ease.
Mhm.
Things are very dynamical, kind of, I don't know, fluid rather than, um, I think more solid in a sort of way. But maybe that'll be like the next place to start thinking about the ways that not just social system, but generally speaking, intelligences work. If you go back to, for example, in the 1940s in
Your
anthropology.
volume
Oh, did it
is
mess up
dropped
again?
precipitously again.
How is this?
Um,
Hello?
yeah, that seems okay, I
Is it
think.
better?
Not really, no.
Oh, okay. Maybe I
Oh,
should
now it's
just,
better. Now it's better. I don't know
okay,
what.
maybe I need to lean in. So what I was saying is that if you go back to like the 1940s, this was a big thing in anthropology. This guy, Leslie White, who I was
Yeah.
extremely influenced by, who talked about technological capture and energetic capture as a way of measuring um, evolution. What he was really talking about was complexity. How is it that social systems are able to ramp up their own complexity in terms of um, things like role specialization, in terms of the amount of affordances available to individuals in that society.
Mhm.
Um, and while that's very much present as kind of a theoretical framework, it's not really formalized. And it seems to be getting at some of these same things that Prigogine and others were talking about in these like non-dissipative, or sorry, in these dissipative non-equilibrium systems.
So I have a phrase that I'm fond of repeating, and I was wondering if this fits into this theoretical model that you're talking about, of individual living organisms,
Mhm.
which is that life is that which resists entropy.
Right.
And I probably didn't come up with this, but I started to repeat it. And so, do you think that that would be accurate under this framework?
Yeah, exactly. Not only does it resist entropy, but it feeds off of ordered parts already, right?
Hmm.
So this is Schrodinger in his famous essay, What is Life, which I haven't read in a long time, so I'm not going to be able to summarize it or anything. That, yeah, living systems resist entropy. They capture ordered states and then they turn that into their own orders, which are effectively negotiated. And what I mean by negotiated is that the system is not doing something that's predefined.
Hmm.
It's figuring out new structural arrangements for itself, such that um, and this is what happens in mutation and natural selection, such that what comes tomorrow is not the same thing that was today. There's this role for open-ended creativity um, in this kind of computation that living systems are doing. Um, that
So,
yeah,
so what I'm hearing is that there's this puzzle, this unresolved mystery between, physics and statistical mechanics,
yeah,
which is sort of down here, and then uh, higher order social systems, which seem to operate on the same principles. You could take formalizations of statistical mechanics and they apply very neatly to analyses of social systems. But
Hmm.
then in the center, you have the individual organism. And the
Yeah.
puzzle is why this system here doesn't seem to align with these other two systems above and below.
Yeah. Yeah. This kind of mesoscale is something that is really poorly understood in most frameworks, right? So, on one level, you have Boltzmann who's saying the way that we need to, or sorry, one of the ways that we can understand what's going on in this world around us is simply by ignoring what's happening on the, very small scale level and thinking more about what happens when we just average these things out, right?
Hmm.
On the other hand, you have Newton who's saying, no, we can actually understand things in terms of just particular causation. Um, but maybe somewhere in the middle, there's a kind of science that says, well, how is it that these causal properties um, tend to emerge into these, larger things that we're starting to average? And so this is part of understanding causality in complex systems. And also, I think gets kind of at the direction I'm heading in my own research in social agency,
Hmm.
understanding again, what is it that the individual actor can do to change these kinds of collective outcomes? So it's on this mesoscale that maybe we need to be thinking a lot more about social systems, but maybe some systems more generally.
All right. Well, so that's the puzzle you're out to solve, Cody. And I guess last question for you today is where are you headed?
Yeah, so right now I'm at the Institute for Pure and Applied Math at UCLA. I was here for a fellowship for a semester. I'm finishing my PhD, and then next year I'll be starting a professor job in Morocco. So I'm actually leaving the United States entirely. Good luck to everyone.
Good luck.
And
I think you'll be fine.
yeah, I think you'll be fine. No,
Have
that's
fun.
true.
Have fun
That's
in
true.
Morocco.
Yeah,
Say
yeah,
hi to the
yeah.
Berbers for me.
So yeah, totally. So we have there's a new university out there getting started, or has been started, Mohammed the Sixth Polytechnic Institute. It's the king, it's Mohammed the Sixth, and so he has this new school out there that um, one of the departments is the School of Collective Intelligence, and so that's where I'll be starting next year. So
Hmm. Awesome. Well, that sounds great. Cody, always a pleasure having you on. Thank you for coming on today.
yeah, it was a blast. Thanks, Alex.